Perfect. Well, let's see how many different impressions of a healthy riverscape we get. Hopefully not too many, but you never know. Did you want to say anything, Joe, before I just kind of facilitate this? All right, so I have the list of the different rooms here. I don't know who all the spokespeople are going to be. In fact, why don't I just take a volunteer for the first person, and then I can kind of check off the list, the different rooms that were there. So does anybody want to go first and just summarize the thoughts that your group had on what a healthy riverscape consists of?
Oh, look at Scott stepping right up there.
Yes. Okay, go Scott.
Sounds good. So we tried to focus a lot of our conversation on the questions we'd ask in terms of that health checkup and not get wrapped around the axle of how we'd assess potential. I think our conversation focused around three main themes. One about connectivity, so how we could assess different components of lateral, longitudinal, or vertical connectivity. We closed with a discussion of, so a quick example of that for lateral connectivity, and that might be things like extent of valley bottom inundated, or things like our valley bottom length as compared to flow path length. We closed with a discussion of the idea of patch dynamics. And I think this one was particularly pertinent to cause me reflecting as a land management agency and some of our passings of managing for, a climax community, as opposed to this idea of managing for messiness, for a patchy landscape, for a dynamic landscape. On that one, in terms of the idea of patch dynamics and the idea of patchiness is better in this dynamic equilibrium, we did not get into a real big discussion of how we do that. So we spent a majority of our time on connectivity and patch dynamics, but we also talked briefly about, assessing whether we have a natural hydrologic regime in terms of a measure of health. And we touched briefly on vegetative composition and cover, kind of idea of contemporary versus historic type comparisons, and what is the state of that vegetation, how would it interact with our hydrologic regime to form different geomorphic surfaces and habitats. Did I miss anything really salient to our group? Hopefully
Excellent.
us focusing on those a bit leaves quite a room for others to share some unique other aspects they consider.
This is Brian. The only thing I think that Chris talked about, and this is where I was able to participate or listen, was dynamism, and just that idea of patchiness. So, yeah.
Agreed.
Great. And I just want to confirm, Joe, do you have a note taker?
Yeah, Jordan has been
Okay.
populating away.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Scott and company. Who wants to go next?
Jordan, are you going to go for our group, or did you want somebody else to?
Can, or you can if you'd like to.
How about you start and I'll jump in if there's anything else I need to add.
So we just, those same things came up with us. 3 dimensions of connectivity, variability or patchiness at different scales. But we also kind of talked about the idea of, well, all these things we were talking about, we were trying to assess kind of within the context of the principles as they stand now, and how they may fit into it or may differ a little bit. And so we talked about how the idea of what the principles are or should be, because we could go into specifics, like there's 1,000 things you could say, makes a river healthy or unhealthy. But the idea behind the principles is that they're big picture guiding things that can then be applied differently depending on the problem or the scale you're looking at, right? So principles, I think, should be something that transcends the idea of like a specific scale or a specific problem. It's like these bigger picture ideas we can use to address those. And so analyzing the principles from that perspective, most of what we talked about fit within them in some way, but we thought maybe the idea of like trophic structure or food webs is something that's not like, that's maybe only kind of implicitly represented that could be better represented in the principles.
Yeah, Joe, on that last one, what we were getting at is that the principles of just biology. A river isn't healthy if there's not the expected species and diversity of species that should be there, and both aquatic and terrestrial. So that kind of gets into, you know, the riparian corridor's health. Are the birds there that should be there? Are the beaver, the river otters? And that expression wasn't, I didn't see how it fit in one of the 4 principles. And so that was just what we wanted to get out there, is this idea that the biology is so important. And we just want to make sure that that's reflected ultimately in a framework.
Perfect. Thanks to both of you. Next.
I can go for Free Govern
Lauren?
2. So we basically worked off of the Riverscape principles as well as Colin's 4 functions. So rather than trying to describe and build from scratch what's a healthy riverscape, we thought we would try to add what we both combine those 2 and add what we thought maybe wasn't represented. So we talked about principle 1, streams need process, space, and water, and then that this is basically a prerequisite geographic and physical requirement, and that process, space, and water promotes dynamism, evolution, and change over time. So for structure, forcing complexity, we added AKA heterogeneity under complexity. And so I think some of what other folks have talked about, so both patch dynamics and just thinking about heterogeneity of any measure, whether it's biological, whether it's species, whether it's sediment size class distribution. We added that. For resilience, I think we added both physical and biological structure as part of, well, sorry, that goes back to structure. We also included habitat and multi-trophic food webs under structure. They both need the structure and they create and provide the structure. They are the structure. So that goes back to Jackie's, what she was saying about species. So inefficient conveyance of water is the same as Colin's conveyance and storage. And we actually focused a lot on this one. So inefficient conveyance of mass. Someone earlier today said mass rather than just water. So it's everything, right? It's sediment, it's nutrients, it's organic material is healthy. And then Jessica, thank you. Jessica introduced something that I was not familiar with, but the converse, that unhealthy riverscapes and ecosystems are leaky and impoverished. So we really focused on this idea of inefficient conveyance of mass, and measuring that is really important for a healthy riverscape. We put dynamic evolution and messiness as hallmarks of inefficient conveyance. And we also sort of lumped connectivity under inefficient conveyance. Sorry, I did that after the breakout room closed because Jessica added it. But I think that inefficient conveyance of mass results in connectivity. And then sorry, we actually switched the order of the importance of structure varies. And we discussed that as the importance of watershed context with different reaches supporting different processes. I also think of, you know, Colin mentioned not a kaleidoscope, but a mosaic, but I think of forest ecology and a mosaic of stand structures, or in the river kaleidoscope concept, basically that you have that mosaic both in space and in time. Does anyone want to add anything from our group?
I think that was good, Lauren. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren. We're down to the last couple of groups here. Who else wants to go next?
Go, there's Alden.
Alan?
Sure. Well, I think one of the first things that we brought up was high lateral and vertical connectivity that distributes water throughout the valley bottom. So rather than just straight up and downstream and being more of a transport reach, it's distributing it through more complex flow paths across a much broader area. Along with that would be more miles of stream and acres of riparian wetland zones. So that's kind of aligned with the broader valley bottom being active and influenced by fluvial processes rather than disconnected from them. Everybody seems to have hit on complexity, and we would agree with that. Often, I think this relates to the presence of structural elements and the geomorphic, hydrologic, and vegetative responses that are created and maintained by those complex hydraulics. Similarly, the diversity, and so we have more diverse and longer hydrologic flow paths, largely created by that heterogeneity, which stores water on the landscape longer, but it also does other things for the aquatic species, from nutrient cycling all the way to thermal refugia, and increases hyporheic flow. I would say that we have more larger extents and diversities of inundation. So rather than having just free flow down a single channel, we'd have primary and secondary channels, but also distributed among areas with free flow, backwater, ponded, that whole hydrologic inefficiency thing. But it's also, I think, pretty critical for the aquatic habitat side. And then resistance and resilience, I think, comes from all of that. So, certainly it's a big topic with the BLM right now and how we mitigate against floods and droughts and other impacts from climate change. And so the ability of these systems to, I guess, increase degrees of freedom for adjustment to other disturbances like flood and drought, post-wildfire issues. And so they're able to sustain their key variables after those disturbances. And then lastly, I think, I kind of thought of this after the discussion, but I've heard a few folks bring in like the habitat side of things. And I think that, the way that we've generally handled this in the BLM is that if you have the processes in place, then you typically can assume that you're producing the resource values, and you don't have to measure them everywhere all the time. In this instance, I think that typically if we are pretty certain that we're mimicking and promoting processes that historically existed in which the native species evolved alongside, that they're providing those resource benefits and resource values for those native species. And so I guess I would tie it to mimicking, promoting, or just it contains the processes and attributes that historically existed on the landscape.
All right, last group.
Yeah, I took notes, so I guess I'll try to sum up. I think we spun our wheels a little bit, kind of like we were discussing the principles. We were really trying to think if these principles are taking into account all the things that you might want to consider for natural, healthy systems. And so we just basically we didn't really try to identify new principles, but pointed out that the principles that have been developed are sort of for a very specific situation, i.e. low-tech process-based restoration. I mean, that's really how we develop them. And so maybe they're not all encompassing enough. I'll leave my group to jump in more there on that. And then we also just talked about how, well, to know if something's healthy, you kind of need to know what it used to be like in the good old days. And that's pretty problematic in a lot of places. And so that is where we kind of spun our wheels on trying to develop things for something you don't really know what you're trying to restore it to. And this, just as an anecdote, our group is working in a lot of intermittent streams now, and we're starting to realize we really aren't very clear on what those things, how they used to function. And so it makes it difficult to apply these principles. A couple we agreed with and talked about things other people did, like what about species diversity, and keystone species was mentioned. You know, if they're missing, that's obviously going to be a problem. And then there was a term or phrase of anthropogenic impact index, just as a way to sum up general impact, what might be useful. And then a natural disturbance regime, which would maybe be something that you would be interested at a larger scale. If those, you know, fires are more frequent, well, that's going to impact your river health. Anything else, group? Or a better way of saying some of those things?
All right, I think we got everybody, Joe. What'd you hear?
Well, I heard some relief that people got to interact a little one-on-one. That was good. I heard a lot of pretty kind of thoughtful consideration of how you think about health, and I'm just trying to pinpoint the ones that push us towards, do we need a do we revise a principle, or do we need another? And I'm wondering, just partly seeing how people perked up, getting to try and actually do something. I'm wondering if we do this again, but to force each group to reword or add, right? You just have this like, well, what do you think health is, right? And who cares if we come up with something that's you know, that survives the test of time here? But I think it'd be helpful to why this is fresh on each group and keep the same rooms. Okay, so we just went through those things. We raised some things. So for example, in our group, and Scott summarized this, you know, the issue of connectivity. Okay, so vertical, lateral, longitudinal connectivity. So our group has a decision to make. Do we argue that that is well represented in a principle of inefficiency? And we're done. Or we argue that it could be well represented in there, but we better reword that inefficiency principle, or something's missing. I mean, that's what we're trying to do today anyway. So I'm just wondering if maybe that's where we go. Jeremy, you have a thought?
Well, yeah.
You don't like that?
I do.
Okay.
I just wonder how much, you know, I'm deeply familiar with the principles. I wonder how much everyone here knows exactly what you meant when you said those things, or do you need to actually just walk through the 4 principles one time to say, here's what we mean here. And then we take a 10-minute break, let us grab a cup of coffee, go to the bathroom. We come back, we go to our breakouts, and we help you reword them or add new ones or whatever at that point. But I think you have to explain to everyone what was meant with the original principles first. It doesn't have to take too long.
Yeah.
I know that's asking a lot for you, but you know.
Well, here's, I get one slide. And
okay, there you go.
That's it.
Just so it's fresh and we explain what you really mean there.